High in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 12-year-old Caleb had spent his whole life exploring the dense, forgotten hollows where few ever wandered. But on that cold October morning, something drew him off his usual trail, deep into a ravine choked with brambles and fallen timber. There, half buried under decades of leaves and creeping vines, lay the twisted wreckage of a car, a rusted skeleton that the forest had tried to swallow whole. Caleb brushed away the debris from the driver's window and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. This was no ordinary accident. The bones of a man still sat behind the wheel, but clutched in his skeletal hand was something that should never have been there, something that pointed to a crime buried for 30 years. What secret had this man died protecting, and who would kill to keep it hidden? Caleb ran through the forest, his boots pounding against the carpet of fallen leaves, his breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to mist in the cold mountain air. The image of those skeletal fingers clutching the leather object burned in his mind, refusing to fade no matter how fast he ran. By the time he reached the edge of the tree line and saw the small weathered cabin nestled in the clearing below, his legs were trembling and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was home, a modest structure of hand-hewn logs and a rusted tin roof that his grandfather had built 60 years ago, passed down through generations of his family who had carved out a life in these unforgiving hills. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the sight of it, so ordinary and familiar, made the horror of what he had just witnessed feel like a fever dream. But it was no dream, and Caleb knew it. He slowed his pace as he approached the front porch, forcing himself to breathe, to think. His mother would be home soon from her shift at the Ridgeway Diner, the only restaurant in the small town of Crestwood that sat in the valley below. Mary worked double shifts most days, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, her hands cracked from washing dishes and her feet swollen from hours of standing, all to keep food on their table and the electricity running. She had taken on this brutal schedule 3 years ago, after Caleb's father, Daniel, had been killed in what the Holbrook Mining Corporation called a routine accident. A tunnel collapse, they said, an act of God, unavoidable. They had paid Mary a settlement, a check that felt like blood money, and closed the case before the earth had even settled on Daniel's grave. Caleb had been 9 years old then, old enough to understand that his father was never coming back, old enough to see the way his mother aged 10 years in a single month, but too young to do anything about the injustice that gnawed at his gut like a living thing. In the years since, Caleb had become the man of the house in every way that mattered. He chopped the firewood, repaired the roof when it leaked, hunted small game to stretch their grocery budget, and walked the 6 miles to school and back every day without complaint. He was small for his age, with a lean, wiry frame built for climbing and scrambling through the rugged terrain, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's sharp, watchful eyes. The other kids in town called him the mountain boy, and they meant it as an insult, a way of saying he was wild, poor, and strange. But Caleb wore the name like armor. He knew these mountains better than anyone alive. Every ridge and hollow, every hidden spring and abandoned logging road. The forest was his classroom, his church, his refuge from a world that had taken so much from him. And now the forest had shown him something terrible, a secret it had kept for 3 decades, and Caleb did not know what to do with it. He sat down on the porch steps, his mind racing. He should tell someone. That was the right thing to do. There was a dead man in that car, a man with a family somewhere who had never known what happened to him. But who could he tell? Sheriff Granger was a known friend of the Holbrook family, and the county officials all owed their jobs to the mining company's influence. If Caleb reported the wreck, word would get back to the Holbrooks before the day was out. And what then? What if that man in the car had died because he knew something the Holbrooks wanted buried? Caleb thought of his mother, of her tired eyes and trembling hands, of how hard she worked just to keep them afloat. He could not bring more trouble to her door, not without understanding what he was dealing with first. He needed to go back. He needed to know what that dead man had been holding, and why someone had left him to rot in a forgotten ravine for 30 years. The screen door creaked open just after 7 o'clock, and Mary stepped inside, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her faded blue uniform stained with coffee and grease from another endless shift at the diner. Caleb was sitting at the small wooden table, pretending to work on his homework by the light of a kerosene lamp, but the words on the page blurred together, meaningless shapes that his mind refused to process. Mary smiled at him, that weary but genuine smile that always made him feel both loved and guilty. and she asked him about his day as she hung her coat on the hook by the door. "Fine," he said, the lie coming out smoothly even as his stomach churned with the weight of what he was hiding. He had rehearsed the word a dozen times while waiting for her, knowing that if he said too much or too little, she would see right through him. Mary had a gift for reading people, honed by years of serving customers who lied about their tips and bosses who lied about their promises, and Caleb could not risk her discovering the truth. Not yet, not until he understood what he had found. She heated up a pot of leftover soup on the wood stove, and they ate together in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the pop of burning logs in the fireplace. Caleb forced himself to eat, though each bite felt like swallowing stones, and he excused himself early, claiming he was tired from a long walk in the woods. Mary kissed his forehead and told him she loved him, and he climbed the narrow ladder to the loft where his small bed was tucked beneath the sloping roof. He lay there in the darkness, staring up at the rough-hewn beams, listening to his mother move around below as she washed the dishes and prepared for another early morning. When she finally extinguished the lamp and settled into her own bed, the cabin fell into a silence so deep that Caleb could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every time he did, he saw the wrecked car, the vines crawling over it like grasping fingers, the shattered window, and the skull grinning at him from the driver's seat. He saw those skeletal hands clutching the leather object, holding it tight even in death, as if it were more precious than life itself. What was it? What could possibly be worth dying for, worth being forgotten in a ravine for 30 years? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, and sleep would not come. Hours passed, the darkness outside the small window shifting from black to the deep blue of early morning, and still Caleb lay awake, his body exhausted but his mind on fire. He thought about telling his mother, about going to the sheriff, about forgetting the whole thing and never returning to that ravine again. But he knew he could not do any of those things. He was not built for ignorance, for turning away from a mystery that demanded to be solved. His father had taught him that. Daniel had been a man of few words, but the words he spoke carried weight, and Caleb remembered one conversation with perfect clarity. They had been hiking together on a ridge above the cabin, looking out at the endless waves of mountains rolling toward the horizon, and his father had said that the mountains keep secrets, some of them beautiful and some of them terrible, but secrets are not meant to stay buried forever. Sometimes, he said, a man has to bring them into the light, even if it costs him. Caleb had not fully understood those words at the time, but he understood them now. That dead man in the car had known something important enough to get him killed, and whoever had put him there believed the secret was buried forever. But the mountains had revealed it to Caleb, a boy who knew every hidden corner of these hills, and that meant something. It had to mean something. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the window, Caleb made his decision. He would go back to the wreck. He would find out what the dead man had been holding, and he would bring the truth into the light, no matter what it cost him. He owed it to his father, to his mother, and to the man who had been left to rot in that forgotten ravine. The mountains had trusted him with their secret, and he would not let them down. Caleb waited until his mother left for her morning shift, watching from the window as her old pickup truck rattled down the dirt road and disappeared around the bend, and then he moved with purpose, gathering the supplies he would need for his return to the ravine. He retrieved his father's old hunting knife from the wooden box beneath his parents' bed, the blade still sharp and gleaming despite the years, its leather sheath worn smooth by Daniel's hands. He found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, tested the batteries to make sure it worked, and stuffed it into his backpack along with a coil of rope, a canteen of water, and a handful of biscuits wrapped in a cloth napkin. The morning air was cold and damp, a fine mist hanging in the hollows as he set out into the forest. And Caleb pulled his jacket tight around him as he walked, his breath forming small clouds that vanished into the gray. He moved quickly, his feet finding the familiar paths without conscious thought, but as he drew closer to the ravine, his pace slowed, and his heart began to pound with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of him hoped that he had imagined the whole thing, that he would arrive at the spot and find nothing but rocks and trees and fallen leaves, but he knew better. The mountains did not lie, and neither did his eyes. He reached the edge of the ravine and paused, looking down at the tangle of brush and timber below. And there it was, exactly as he had left it, the rusted hulk of the car crouching in the shadows like a wounded animal. Caleb took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and began his descent, using the rope to lower himself down the steep slope, his boots slipping on the wet leaves and loose soil. The smell hit him before he reached the bottom, a faint but unmistakable odor of decay and rust and rotting upholstery, and he pulled his shirt up over his nose as he approached the wreck. The car was an old model, probably from the late 80s or early 90s, its paint long since faded to a uniform brown, its tires flat and cracked, its metal body crushed and twisted from the impact of its fall into the ravine. Vines and moss had colonized every surface, and a small tree had grown up through the space where the engine used to be, its roots wrapped around the axle like a possessive hand. Caleb circled the vehicle slowly, taking in every detail, and then he approached the driver's side window, the glass long since shattered, and looked inside. The skeleton sat in the same position as before, slumped against the seat, its empty eye sockets staring at nothing, its jaw hanging open in a silent scream. But Caleb forced himself to look past the horror, to focus on the object clutched in the bony fingers. It was a small leather journal, about the size of his hand, its cover cracked and stained, but remarkably intact given the decades it had spent in this damp, forgotten place. Caleb reached through the window, his hand trembling, and carefully pried the journal free from the skeleton's grip, the bones clicking softly as the fingers released their hold. He held the journal up to the light, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the significance of it. This was what the dead man had been protecting, what he had held on to even as he died. Caleb tucked it carefully into his backpack and turned his attention to the rest of the car. He opened the passenger door, the hinges screaming in protest, and peered inside, sweeping the flashlight beam across the debris-covered seats and floor. Something glinted beneath the passenger seat, a metallic edge barely visible under a layer of rotted leaves and dirt. Caleb reached in, his fingers brushing against cold metal, and he pulled the object free. It was a briefcase, small but heavy, made of dull gray metal, with a combination lock on the front. He tried the latches, but they were sealed tight, the lock refusing to budge. Whatever was inside, the dead man had wanted it protected, hidden, safe from whoever had sent him tumbling into this ravine. Caleb sat back on his heels, the journal in his backpack and the briefcase in his hands, and he knew that he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He was no longer just a boy who had stumbled upon an old wreck. He was now the keeper of a dead man's secrets, and those secrets, whatever they were, had been worth killing for. Caleb hid the briefcase beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's small root cellar, a space so cramped and dark that his mother never ventured there, and then he climbed up to his loft with the leather journal clutched against his chest like a talisman. He waited until the afternoon light slanted through his small window at just the right angle, providing enough illumination to read by without needing the lamp that might draw his mother's attention when she returned. And then he opened the journal with trembling fingers, the cracked leather cover releasing a faint smell of mildew and age. The first page bore a name written in neat, precise handwriting, Thomas Garrett, and below it, an address in Crestwood and a date, March 1994. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. 30 years ago, almost to the month, this man had begun writing in this journal, and now his bones sat in a rusted car at the bottom of a ravine, forgotten by the world. Caleb turned the page and began to read, his eyes moving slowly over the faded ink, deciphering the words that Thomas Garrett had written in the final weeks of his life. The early entries were mundane, the daily notes of a county surveyor going about his routine work, measuring property lines, and mapping terrain for various clients throughout the region. Thomas wrote about the weather, about his wife Eleanor and their young daughter, about the small frustrations and satisfactions of his job. He seemed like a decent, ordinary man, someone who took pride in his work and loved his family, and Caleb felt a pang of sorrow knowing how his story would end. But then the tone of the entries began to change. In April of 1994, Thomas was assigned to conduct a land survey for the Holbrook Mining Corporation, a routine job that involved mapping a remote section of mountain property the company had recently acquired. At first, he wrote about the work with his usual professional detachment, noting the coordinates and elevations and soil compositions with meticulous care. But then he began to notice things that troubled him. There were areas of the property where the vegetation was dead or dying, patches of brown and withered plants in places that should have been lush with spring growth. He found streams that ran with a strange discoloration, a milky, iridescent sheen that reminded him of oil or chemical runoff. He noted sinkholes and depressions in the terrain that suggested underground disturbances, cavities in the earth that were not marked on any geological survey. Thomas began to investigate on his own time, venturing beyond the boundaries of his assigned survey area, following the contaminated streams to their source. What he found horrified him. Deep in a hollow on the back side of the mountain, hidden from any road or trail, he discovered a series of large pits filled with rusted barrels and industrial waste, the soil around them blackened and dead, the air thick with a chemical smell that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. He took photographs with a small camera he carried for documenting his surveys, and he collected samples of the soil and water, sealing them in glass vials he brought from home. He wrote in the journal that he could not believe what he was seeing, that a company as prominent as Holbrook Mining would engage in such blatant and dangerous illegal dumping, that the contamination he was documenting could poison the groundwater for the entire valley, sickening or killing hundreds of people who drew their drinking water from wells and springs fed by these mountains. Caleb read these words with a growing sense of horror and recognition, because he knew that the people Thomas was writing about were his own neighbors, his own family, people who had lived on this land for generations and trusted that the water they drank was clean and safe. He thought about the stories he had heard over the years, whispered conversations about cancer clusters and mysterious illnesses, children born with defects, and old folks dying before their time, and he felt a cold rage building in his chest. Thomas Garrett had discovered the truth 30 years ago, and he had died for it, and the Holbrooks had gone on poisoning the land and the people as if nothing had happened. Caleb closed the journal, his hands shaking, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just read. This was not just a mystery anymore. This was a crime, a monstrous ongoing crime, and he was the only one who knew the truth. Caleb turned the pages with increasing urgency, his eyes devouring the words that Thomas Garrett had written in the final days of his life, each entry more alarming than the last. The surveyor had not been content with simply documenting the surface contamination, the dead vegetation and discolored streams that had first aroused his suspicion. He had gone deeper, literally and figuratively, into the heart of the Holbrooks operation. Thomas wrote about discovering a series of natural caverns that honeycomb the mountain beneath the Holbrook property, vast underground chambers carved by water over millions of years, and these caverns, he realized with dawning horror, were connected to the aquifer that supplied drinking water to every well and spring in the valley below. The Holbrooks had found these caverns decades earlier and had been using them as a dumping ground for the toxic byproducts of their mining operations. Hundreds of barrels of chemical sludge and heavy metals and industrial solvents, all of it seeping slowly into the underground water supply like poison spreading through a bloodstream. Thomas had mapped the cavern system as best he could, crawling through narrow passages with his flashlight and compass, and he had documented everything with photographs and soil samples and water tests that showed contamination levels far exceeding any legal limit. He wrote about the rage he felt, the disbelief that any company, any human beings, could knowingly poison an entire community for the sake of profit, and he wrote about his determination to stop them. He was going to take everything he had gathered, all the photographs and samples and test results, and he was going to drive to the state capitol and present it to the environmental authorities, the Attorney General, anyone who would listen. He knew the Holbrooks were powerful, that they had friends in the county government and the sheriff's office and probably higher, but he believed that the evidence he had collected was so overwhelming, so damning, that no amount of influence could suppress it. He wrote about kissing his wife Eleanor goodbye, about hugging his daughter and promising to bring her back a present from the city, about loading the briefcase with all his evidence into his car and setting out on the long drive east. The final entry was dated the 15th of October 1994, the day before Thomas Garrett vanished from the face of the earth. Caleb stared at those last words, written in the same neat, precise handwriting as all the others, and he felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air in the loft. Thomas had never made it to the state capitol. He had never presented his evidence to anyone. Someone had stopped him, had run him off the road or ambushed him on some lonely stretch of mountain highway, and they had sent his car tumbling into that ravine where it sat for 30 years, swallowed by the forest, forgotten by the world. And the briefcase, the metal briefcase that Caleb had found wedged under the passenger seat, that must be the same briefcase Thomas had mentioned, the one containing all his evidence, the photographs and samples and test results that could bring down the Holbrook empire. Thomas had died trying to protect it, had clutched his journal in his hands as if it were a lifeline, and now that evidence was sitting in Caleb's root cellar, waiting to be brought into the light. Caleb closed the journal and pressed it against his forehead, his mind spinning with the enormity of what he had discovered. This was so much bigger than he had imagined, so much more dangerous. The Holbrooks had killed to protect this secret 30 years ago, and they were still in power, still running their mining operation, still poisoning the water that his mother drank, that he drank, that everyone in Crestwood drank. If they found out that Caleb had the journal and the briefcase, that he knew what Thomas Garrett had known, they would kill him too without hesitation or remorse. He thought about his mother, about her tired eyes and her calloused hands and her unwavering love for him, and he thought about his father, buried in the cemetery on the hill, killed in what the Holbrooks had called an accident. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like a punch to the gut, Caleb understood that his father's death and Thomas Garrett's death were connected, that the Holbrooks had been silencing anyone who threatened their secrets for decades, and that he was now standing in the crosshairs of the same murderous machine. He had to be careful, he had to be smart. But he also had to act, because the truth that Thomas Garrett had died for was too important to stay buried any longer. Caleb sat in his loft as the afternoon light faded to dusk, the journal resting on his knees, his mind churning with dark thoughts that seemed to multiply with every passing minute. He had grown up in Crestwood, had lived his entire 12 years in the shadow of the Holbrook Mining Corporation, and he knew better than most how completely the family's influence permeated every aspect of life in the valley. The Holbrook name was everywhere, stamped on buildings and parks and scholarships, spoken with a mixture of respect and fear by people who depended on the company for their livelihoods. Victor Holbrook, the current head of the family, was treated like royalty whenever he came down from his mansion on the ridge, his black SUV gliding through town while shopkeepers waved and smiled and pretended they were not terrified of displeasing him. Caleb had seen Victor a handful of times, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and a face that seemed carved from stone, his eyes cold and calculating behind expensive glasses. He gave speeches at the 4th of July parade and donated money to the volunteer fire department and sponsored the Little League team, and everyone praised him for his generosity, for carrying on the family tradition of supporting the community. But Caleb knew now what that tradition really meant, what it had always meant. The Holbrooks did not support the community. They owned it, controlled it, poisoned it, and silenced anyone who dared to speak the truth. Victor's father, Raymond Holbrook, had been running the company when Thomas Garrett disappeared, and Raymond had almost certainly ordered the surveyor's death, had sent men to intercept him on that lonely mountain road and make sure he never reached the state capital. And now Raymond was dead, buried in the family mausoleum, with a marble statue and a plaque praising his contributions to the region, and his son Victor had inherited not just the company but the legacy of murder and corruption that sustained it. Caleb thought about the sheriff, Bill Granger, a heavy-set man with a red face and a booming laugh, who had been in office for as long as Caleb could remember. Granger was a regular at the Holbrook mansion, invited to hunting parties and Christmas dinners, and everyone knew that he owed his position to the family's support. If Thomas Garrett's disappearance had ever been investigated, Granger would have made sure it went nowhere, would have filed it away as a missing persons case and let the years bury it under layers of dust and indifference. The county commissioners, the judges, the prosecutors, they were all the same, all beholden to the Holbrooks for their careers and their comfortable lives, all willing to look the other way while the family dumped poison into the water and eliminated anyone who objected. Caleb felt a wave of helpless anger wash over him as he realized the full scope of what he was up against. Thomas Garrett had been a grown man, a professional with evidence and resources and a plan, and the Holbrooks had crushed him like an insect. What chance did a 12-year-old boy have against that kind of power? He could go to the sheriff, but Granger would just confiscate the journal and the briefcase and hand them over to Victor Holbrook with an apology for the inconvenience. He could try to contact the state authorities himself, but he had no car, no phone, no money, and the moment he tried to leave town, word would get back to the Holbrooks, and they would stop him the same way they had stopped Thomas. He was trapped, alone with a secret that could get him killed, and he did not know what to do. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, another emotion began to kindle in his chest, a small, fierce flame of determination that refused to be extinguished. Thomas Garrett had been murdered, and his killer had never been caught, had never faced justice, had gone on living a life of wealth and privilege, while Thomas's bones rotted in a forgotten ravine. That was wrong. That was an abomination that cried out to be corrected, and Caleb could not simply walk away and pretend he did not know the truth. He thought about his father again, about the tunnel collapse that had taken his life, and he wondered how many other deaths the Holbrooks were responsible for. How many families had been destroyed by their greed and ruthlessness? Someone had to stop them. Someone had to bring the truth into the light, no matter how powerful they were, no matter how dangerous. And if that someone had to be a 12-year-old mountain boy with nothing but a dead man's journal and a locked briefcase, then so be it. Caleb waited 3 days before he told his mother, 3 days of carrying the weight of Thomas Garrett's journal like a stone in his chest, 3 days of watching Mary come home exhausted from her shifts and wondering if the truth would break her or set her free. He chose a Sunday evening, her one night off, when they sat together at the small table, eating a dinner of beans and cornbread that she had made from scratch, the fire crackling in the hearth and the wind sighing through the pines outside. Mary was telling him about a customer at the diner, a funny story about a man who had ordered 6 slices of pie and eaten them all in one sitting, and she was laughing, a rare and precious sound that made Caleb's heart ache with love for her. He did not want to take that laughter away, did not want to burden her with the darkness he had discovered, but he knew he could not carry this alone any longer. He needed her wisdom, her guidance, her strength, because the path ahead was too dangerous for a boy to walk by himself. So, when she finished her story and the laughter faded, Caleb took a deep breath and told her about the journal. He did not mention the body, did not describe the skeleton clutching the leather book in its bony fingers, because he knew that image would haunt her nightmares the way it haunted his. Instead, he said he had found the journal in the woods, in an old abandoned car, and that he had read it and discovered something terrible about the Holbrook Mining Corporation. He told her about Thomas Garrett, the county surveyor who had disappeared 30 years ago, and about the illegal dumping and the poisoned water and the evidence that Thomas had gathered before he vanished. Mary listened in silence, her face growing pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard that her knuckles turned white. When Caleb finished, she did not speak for a long moment, and he could see her processing the information, turning it over in her mind, calculating the dangers and the implications. And then she looked at him with an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of fear and fury and fierce protective love that made her seem like a different person entirely. She told him to stay away from this, to put the journal back where he found it and forget he had ever seen it, to never speak of it again to anyone. She said the Holbrooks were not people to be trifled with, that they had destroyed lives and families without a moment's hesitation, and that she would not lose her son the way she had lost her husband. Caleb started to protest, to argue that they had a responsibility to bring the truth to light, but Mary cut him off with a sharpness that startled him. She said there was something he needed to know, something she had never told him because she wanted to protect him, but he was old enough now and he needed to understand what they were dealing with. She told him that his father, Daniel, had not simply died in a tunnel collapse. 3 months before the accident, Daniel had gone to his supervisors at the mine with concerns about safety violations, about support beams that were rotting, and ventilation systems that were failing, and equipment that had not been inspected in years. He had put his complaints in writing and submitted them through the proper channels, expecting that the company would address the problems and make the mine safe for the workers. Instead, he was demoted from his position as a shift foreman to a common laborer, his pay cut in half, his reputation smeared with rumors that he was a troublemaker and a malcontent. His former friends stopped talking to him, afraid of being associated with someone who had crossed the Holbrooks, and Daniel became isolated, depressed, a shadow of the confident man he had once been. And then, 3 months later, the tunnel collapsed, and Daniel was the only one killed, caught in a section of the mine that he should never have been assigned to in the first place. Mary's voice broke as she told the story, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she said she had always suspected that the Holbrooks had arranged Daniel's death, had punished him for daring to speak out, but she had no proof and no power and no way to fight them. She had kept silent to protect Caleb, to keep him safe from the same fate, and now he was walking straight into the lion's den with a dead man's journal that could get them both killed. Caleb listened to his mother's words, felt them land like blows against his heart, and something shifted inside him, a final piece clicking into place. His father had not died in an accident. His father had been murdered by the Holbrooks, just like Thomas Garrett, killed for the crime of telling the truth and expecting justice. The grief and rage that surged through Caleb in that moment was almost unbearable, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to sweep him away, but beneath it all was a cold, clear resolve that anchored him to his purpose. He took his mother's hands in his and looked into her eyes and promised her that he would be careful, that he would not do anything reckless, but he could not walk away from this, not now, not knowing what he knew. He owed it to his father, to Thomas Garrett, to everyone the Holbrooks had hurt and killed and poisoned. He was going to find a way to bring them down, and he was going to need her help to do it. The trail to Ezra Tate's cabin was not marked on any map, and most people in Crestwood had forgotten it even existed, but Caleb had learned its location years ago from his father during one of their long hikes through the mountains. Daniel had spoken of Ezra with a respect that bordered on reverence, describing him as a man of unshakable integrity who had walked away from power rather than compromise his principles, and Caleb had never forgotten those words even though he had never met the man himself. Ezra had been the sheriff of the county for nearly 20 years, his father had said, a lawman who believed in justice and fairness and protecting the people who could not protect themselves. But one day he had simply resigned without explanation and retreated into the wilderness, and no one had heard from him since. Some people said he had gone crazy, that the isolation and the solitude had broken his mind, while others whispered that he knew things about the powerful families in the county that had made him a target, that he had fled into the mountains to save his own life. Caleb did not know which version was true, but he knew that Ezra Tate was the only person in the region who might have the knowledge and the courage to help him, the only person who was not beholden to the Holbrooks and their web of corruption. So on a cold morning, 3 days after his conversation with his mother, Caleb packed the journal into his backpack along with some food and water and set out into the forest. Following the faint trail that wound deeper and deeper into the wilderness, climbing higher into the mountains where the air grew thin and the trees grew stunted, and the silence was so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat. He walked for hours, his legs aching and his lungs burning, scrambling over rock slides and pushing through thickets of rhododendron and crossing icy streams on slippery stones. And more than once he wondered if he was lost, if the trail had faded away entirely, and he was wandering in circles through an endless maze of trees. But he kept going, trusting his instincts and his memory and the lessons his father had taught him about reading the land. And just when he was beginning to despair, he crested a ridge and saw it below him. A small cabin nestled in a hollow beside a rushing creek, smoke curling from its chimney into the gray sky. The cabin was rough and weathered, built of logs that had silvered with age, its roof covered with moss and its porch cluttered with firewood and animal pelts and the various tools of a self-sufficient life. Caleb approached slowly, his heart pounding, not knowing what kind of reception he would receive from a man who had spent 30 years avoiding human contact. He was halfway across the clearing when the front door swung open and a figure emerged onto the porch, and Caleb stopped in his tracks, suddenly uncertain. Ezra Tate was tall and gaunt, with a long white beard that reached to his chest and wild hair that fell past his shoulders, his face weathered and creased like old leather, his eyes pale blue and piercing beneath bushy brows. He wore a flannel shirt and canvas pants held up by suspenders, and in his hands he held a double-barreled shotgun that was pointed directly at Caleb's chest. The old man did not speak, just stood there watching with those unsettling eyes, and Caleb realized he would have to make the first move. He raised his hands slowly to show he was not a threat, and he called out that his name was Caleb, that his father was Daniel, who had worked at the Holbrook mine, and that he had come seeking help because he had found something in the mountains that he did not know what to do with. Ezra's expression did not change, the shotgun did not waver, and for a long moment Caleb thought the old man was going to order him off the property, or simply shoot him where he stood. But then something flickered in those pale eyes, a spark of curiosity or recognition, or perhaps just the loneliness of a man who had not spoken to another soul in years, and Ezra lowered the shotgun a few inches and asked in a voice like gravel scraping over stone what exactly it was that Caleb had found. Caleb took a deep breath, reached into his backpack, and pulled out the leather journal, holding it up so Ezra could see. He said it belonged to a man named Thomas Garrett, a surveyor who disappeared 30 years ago, and that it contained evidence of crimes committed by the Holbrook Mining Corporation, crimes that were still being covered up to this day. The effect on Ezra was immediate and dramatic. The old man's face went pale, his hands trembled, and he lowered the shotgun completely, letting it hang at his side as if he had forgotten he was holding it. He stared at the journal for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said he knew Thomas Garrett, that he had been the one investigating his disappearance when he was still sheriff, and that the case had been the reason he had resigned and retreated into the mountains. He told Caleb to come inside, and as the boy climbed the porch steps and followed the old man through the door, he felt for the first time that he might not be alone in this fight after all. The inside of Ezra's cabin was dark and cluttered, lit only by the faint glow of the fire crackling in a stone hearth and the pale light filtering through grimy windows that had not been cleaned in years. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with books and old newspapers and mason jars filled with preserved vegetables and dried herbs, and every surface was covered with the detritus of a solitary life. Tin cups and whittling knives and coils of rope and stacks of yellowed paper covered with handwriting that Caleb could not read in the dim light. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the faint musk of animal hides, and Caleb stood just inside the doorway, uncertain whether to sit or speak or simply wait for the old man to make the first move. Ezra had set the shotgun against the wall, and now stood with his back to Caleb, staring into the fire, his shoulders hunched and his hands clenched at his sides. And the silence stretched between them like a living thing, heavy and oppressive. When Ezra finally spoke, his voice was harsh and bitter, and he said he did not talk about the past, did not want to hear about Thomas Garrett or the Holbrooks or any of the poison that had driven him into exile all those years ago. He said Caleb should take his journal and go back down the mountain and forget he had ever come here, because there was nothing an old hermit could do to help him, and nothing good could come from digging up bones that had been buried for 30 years. Caleb felt his heart sink, felt the fragile hope he had carried up the mountain begin to crumble, but he refused to give up so easily. He stepped forward and held out the journal, his voice steady despite the fear and desperation churning in his gut, and he said that Thomas Garrett had died trying to expose the Holbrooks, had been murdered to keep their crimes a secret, and that his bones were still lying in a wrecked car at the bottom of a ravine where no one had found them for 3 decades. He said the Holbrooks were still dumping poison into the water supply, still sickening and killing people throughout the valley, and that someone had to stop them before more innocent lives were destroyed. He said he was just a kid, that he did not have the knowledge or the resources to fight a corporation as powerful as Holbrook Mining, but he had found the evidence that Thomas had gathered, and he believed it was enough to bring them down if only he could get it into the right hands. And then he said the words that he knew would cut deepest, the words that might break through the old man's walls of bitterness and despair. He said that Ezra had been a lawman once, had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that Thomas Garrett had trusted him to find the truth and deliver justice, and that Caleb was asking him now to honor that trust, to finish what he had started 30 years ago. Ezra stood motionless for a long moment, his back still turned, and Caleb could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled at his sides. And then, slowly, the old man turned around, and Caleb saw that his eyes were glistening with tears, his weathered face twisted with an emotion that might have been grief or shame or rage or all 3 at once. He reached out and took the journal from Caleb's hands, holding it gently as if it were a sacred relic, and he opened it to the first page and read the name written there in Thomas Garrett's neat, precise script. He closed his eyes for a moment, a single tear rolling down his cheek and disappearing into his white beard, and when he opened them again, something had changed. A hardness in his gaze that had not been there before, a resolve that seemed to straighten his spine and square his shoulders. He told Caleb to sit down, gesturing to a rough wooden chair by the fire, and he lowered himself into another chair across from it, the journal still clutched in his hands. He said he had known Thomas Garrett, had liked and respected him, and that when Thomas disappeared in October of 1994, Ezra had launched an investigation that he believed would be the most important case of his career. Thomas had come to see him a few days before he vanished, Ezra said, and he had been agitated, frightened, talking about evidence he had gathered against the Holbrooks, evidence of environmental crimes that could send people to prison and shut down the mining operation for good. Ezra had urged him to be careful, to let the sheriff's office handle it, but Thomas had been determined to take the evidence to the state authorities himself, convinced that the local officials were too compromised to be trusted. And then Thomas was gone, vanished without a trace, and Ezra had begun to investigate with every resource at his disposal. He had found witnesses who had seen Thomas's car heading east out of town on the morning of October 16th, had traced his route toward the state capitol, had searched the roads and the hollows for any sign of what had happened to him. But before he could make any real progress, the warnings had come. First a phone call from a voice he did not recognize, telling him to drop the case if he knew what was good for him. Then a visit from Raymond Holbrook himself, the patriarch of the family, who sat in Ezra's office and smiled and explained that Thomas Garrett had simply run off with another woman, that his marriage had been troubled and his finances a mess, and that continuing to investigate would only embarrass the man's family and waste the county's resources. Ezra had refused to back down, had told Raymond that he would follow the evidence wherever it led, and the next day he had found his dog poisoned in his front yard and a note on his windshield that said his daughter would be next. Ezra stopped talking then, his voice breaking, and Caleb saw the anguish in his eyes, the weight of a choice that had haunted him for 30 years. He had resigned the next day, Ezra said finally, had packed up his things and retreated into the mountains where the Holbrooks could not reach him, and he had never forgiven himself for his cowardice, for abandoning Thomas Garrett and letting his killers go free. But now, holding the journal in his hands, seeing the proof that Thomas had been telling the truth, he knew he had been given a second chance, an opportunity to make right what he had allowed to go wrong all those years ago. He looked at Caleb with those pale, piercing eyes, and he said he would help, that they would finish this together, but that the boy needed to understand what they were up against. The kind of people who would kill a man and threaten a child and poison a dog without a moment's hesitation. Caleb nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, and he said he understood, that he was ready, that he would not stop until justice was done. Ezra set the journal down on the rough wooden table between them and leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes fixed on Caleb with an intensity that made the boy feel as though he were being examined down to his very soul. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth, sending flickering shadows dancing across the cabin walls, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared purpose settling over them like a heavy blanket. Then Ezra began to talk, his voice low and measured, and Caleb listened with rapt attention as the old man laid out the full scope of what they were facing, the depth of the corruption and the danger that awaited them if they chose to pursue this path. Raymond Holbrook, Ezra said, had been one of the most ruthless and cunning men he had ever encountered, a man who built his empire not just on coal and timber but on fear and intimidation and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. He had come to the valley in the 1,960 seconds with money from back east and a vision of extracting every ounce of wealth from these mountains, regardless of the cost to the land or the people who lived on it. And within a decade he had established Holbrook Mining as the dominant force in the region, buying up property and politicians and law enforcement with equal ease. Raymond understood that true power was not just about money but about control, about making sure that everyone who mattered owed him something, that every official and judge and businessman knew that their prosperity depended on his goodwill. He cultivated relationships with state legislators and federal regulators, donated generously to political campaigns and community organizations, and presented himself to the world as a benevolent patriarch who only wanted to bring jobs and prosperity to an impoverished region. But behind that facade of civic virtue was a man capable of anything, a man who would bribe and blackmail and threaten and kill to protect his interests, and Ezra had seen the evidence of his handiwork too many times to have any illusions about what he was dealing with. When Thomas Garrett began asking questions about the illegal dumping, when he started collecting evidence that could expose the contamination and bring the full weight of environmental law down on the company, Raymond would have seen him as an existential threat, a danger that had to be eliminated quickly and permanently. Ezra believed that Raymond had ordered Thomas intercepted on his way to the state capital, that men working for the company had forced his car off one of the remote mountain roads and sent it tumbling into the ravine where Caleb had found it 30 years later. They would have searched the car for the briefcase, for the evidence Thomas had gathered, but perhaps in the chaos of the crash it had been thrown beneath the seat where they could not find it. Or perhaps they had simply assumed it was destroyed along with everything else and had not bothered to look carefully. Either way, the briefcase had remained hidden all these years, waiting to be discovered, and Ezra said it almost certainly contained the physical proof that Thomas had referenced in his journal. The soil samples and water tests and photographs that could prove beyond any doubt what the Holbrooks had done. Caleb told him about the briefcase then, about finding it wedged under the passenger seat and hiding it in the root cellar beneath his cabin, and Ezra's eyes widened with something that looked almost like hope, a spark of light in the darkness that had consumed him for 3 decades. He said they needed to retrieve it as soon as possible, that the physical evidence combined with the journal would be enough to take to the federal authorities, people who were beyond the reach of the Holbrooks' influence, and who would have the power to investigate and prosecute regardless of how many local officials were on the company's payroll. But he warned Caleb again that the danger was real and immediate, that Victor Holbrook had inherited his father's ruthlessness along with his fortune, and that the moment they made any move against the company they would become targets. Raymond was dead now, buried 5 years ago with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a man of his stature. But his son had learned well at his knee, had been groomed from childhood to protect the family's interests at any cost, and he would not hesitate to use the same tactics his father had used against Thomas Garrett. They would need to be careful, Ezra said, to move quietly and trust no one until they were ready to bring the full weight of the evidence down on the Holbrooks' heads. Caleb nodded, his jaw set with determination, and he said he understood, that he was not afraid, that he would do whatever it took to get justice for Thomas Garrett, and for his father, and for everyone the Holbrooks had hurt. Ezra studied him for a long moment, and then he did something Caleb had not expected. He smiled, a small, sad smile that creased his weathered face and made him look almost human again. And he said that Caleb reminded him of someone he used to know, a young man with more courage than sense who had believed that the truth was worth fighting for no matter the cost. He said that young man had been himself, a long time ago, before the world had beaten it out of him, and that maybe it was time to find that person again. They set out at first light the next morning, Ezra leading the way down the mountain with a sureness of foot that belied his age, his long stride eating up the distance as Caleb hurried to keep pace. The old man had transformed overnight, the bitter hermit replaced by something harder and more purposeful, a lawman on a mission that had been delayed for 30 years but never forgotten. He carried a pack on his back with tools and supplies, and Caleb noticed that he had strapped a holstered revolver to his belt, a grim reminder of the danger they were walking into. They spoke little as they hiked, saving their breath for the steep terrain, but there was a sense of shared resolve between them that needed no words, an understanding that they were committed to this path no matter where it led. By mid-morning they reached the ravine, and Caleb guided Ezra down the treacherous slope to the wrecked car, watching the old man's face as he took in the scene for the first time. Ezra stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the rusted hulk and the skeleton behind the wheel, and Caleb saw his jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists at his sides. He said nothing, but his pale eyes burned with a cold fury that was more frightening than any words could have been, and Caleb understood that Ezra was seeing not just a crime scene but a monument to his own failure, a reminder of the man he had abandoned and the justice he had failed to deliver. Then, Ezra shook off the paralysis and got to work, his movements brisk and efficient as he circled the car and examined the wreckage with the practiced eye of an investigator. Caleb retrieved the briefcase from where he had hidden it beneath a fallen log, and he handed it to Ezra, who set it on a flat rock and knelt before it, pulling a small leather case from his pack that contained a set of slender metal tools. He explained that he had learned to pick locks during his years as sheriff, a skill that had come in handy more times than he could count. And his fingers moved with surprising dexterity as he worked the tools into the combination mechanism, listening for the subtle clicks that would tell him when the tumblers aligned. It took him nearly 15 minutes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, but finally there was a soft snap and the latches released, and Ezra lifted the lid with something like reverence. Inside, nestled in foam padding that had protected them from the decades of moisture and decay, were the treasures that Thomas Garrett had died for. There were dozens of glass vials filled with soil samples, each one labeled with a date and coordinates in Thomas's precise handwriting. There were folded sheets of paper that turned out to be laboratory reports showing contamination levels for arsenic, lead, mercury, and a dozen other toxic substances, numbers so high that Caleb gasped when Ezra read them aloud. There were photographs, faded but still clear, showing massive pits filled with rusted barrels and pools of iridescent sludge, the earth around them blackened and dead. And there was a hand-drawn map of the cavern system beneath the Holbrook property, showing the underground rivers that connected to the aquifer feeding every well in the valley, with arrows marking the flow of contamination from the dump sites to the water supply. Ezra spread the evidence out on the rock, his hands trembling, and he said this was it, this was everything they needed, proof that could not be denied or explained away or buried by lawyers and corrupt officials. Thomas Garrett had done his job, had gathered the evidence that would have brought down the Holbrook empire, and now it was up to them to finish what he had started. They were so absorbed in the evidence spread before them, so focused on the documents and photographs that Thomas Garrett had risked everything to gather, that they almost missed the sound until it was too late. It was Ezra who heard it first, his head snapping up, his body going rigid with the alertness of a man who had spent decades listening for trouble. He held up a hand for silence, and Caleb froze, straining his ears, and then he heard it too, a distant rumble that was growing steadily louder, the unmistakable growl of a vehicle engine pushing through the forest. They looked at each other, and Caleb saw his own fear reflected in Ezra's pale eyes, the sudden terrible realization that they were not alone, that someone else had found this place. Ezra moved with a speed that belied his age, scooping the evidence back into the briefcase and snapping it shut, his movements quick and economical, and he gestured for Caleb to follow, as he scrambled up the side of the ravine toward a dense thicket of rhododendron that would provide cover. They reached the thicket just as the vehicle came into view, a black pickup truck with tinted windows and oversized tires that crushed the underbrush beneath them as it crawled along the faint trail toward the ravine. Caleb pressed himself flat against the ground, his heart hammering in his chest, the damp earth cold against his cheek, and he watched through a gap in the leaves as the truck came to a stop and two men climbed out. The first was tall and heavy-set, with a shaved head and a thick neck that strained against the collar of his black jacket, and he moved with the coiled alertness of a man trained for violence. The second was younger and leaner, with a nervous energy that showed in the way he kept glancing around at the trees, as if expecting an ambush. Ezra leaned close to Caleb's ear, his breath warm against his skin, and whispered a single word that made Caleb's blood run cold. Holt. Caleb knew the name, had heard it spoken in fearful whispers by people in town who knew better than to cross the Holbrooks. Holt was Victor Holbrook's head of security, a former military contractor who handled the company's dirty work, the threats and intimidation, and worse, that kept the Holbrook machine running smoothly. If Holt was here, it meant the Holbrooks knew about the wreck, knew that someone had been poking around, and they had sent their most dangerous man to find out who and why. The two men made their way down into the ravine, their boots slipping on the loose soil, and Caleb watched as they approached the wrecked car and began to search it, pulling open doors and digging through the debris with a methodical efficiency that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. Holt barked orders at his companion, his voice carrying up to where Caleb and Ezra lay hidden, and though Caleb could not make out all the words, he heard enough to understand that they were looking for the briefcase, the evidence that was now clutched in Ezra's hands. The search went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, and finally Holt stood back and cursed, his face twisted with frustration, and he said something to the younger man that made him go pale. They climbed back up to the truck and stood there talking in low voices, and Caleb hardly dared to breathe, certain that at any moment they would look toward the thicket and see him lying there. But then Holt got back in the truck, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle reversed along the trail and disappeared into the forest, the sound of its engine fading slowly until the woods were silent once more. Ezra waited a full 5 minutes before he moved, his caution born of long experience, and then he tapped Caleb on the shoulder and they slipped away through the trees. Moving quickly and quietly in the opposite direction from the truck, the briefcase held tight against Ezra's chest, like a shield against all the darkness that was coming for them. They moved through the forest like ghosts, taking a circuitous route back to Ezra's cabin that added nearly 2 hours to their journey but ensured they were not followed, doubling back on their trail and crossing streams to mask their scent, and watching always for any sign of pursuit. By the time they reached the hollow where Ezra's cabin sat nestled against the mountain, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But Caleb could not appreciate the beauty, could not think of anything except the black truck and Holt's brutal face and the terrible knowledge that the Holbrooks were hunting them. Inside the cabin, Ezra bolted the door and pulled the curtains across the windows before lighting a single lamp, its pale glow casting deep shadows across his weathered features, as he set the briefcase on the table and sank into his chair with a heavy sigh. They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them processing what had happened, and then Ezra spoke, his voice grim and thoughtful. He said the Holbrooks must have learned about Caleb's discovery, must have found out somehow that someone had been to the wreck and taken the evidence, and that meant there was a leak, someone in town who was feeding information to Victor Holbrook and his people. Caleb thought about everyone he had spoken to since finding the car, and his stomach dropped as he realized how careless he had been, how many opportunities there had been for word to reach the wrong ears. He had asked questions at the general store about old cars and abandoned property, had checked out books on local history from the library, had even mentioned to a classmate that he had found something interesting in the woods, never imagining that such innocent comments could be pieced together and reported to men who would kill to keep their secrets buried. Ezra did not blame him, said that the Holbrooks had eyes and ears everywhere and that even the most careful person could not account for every possibility. But he made clear that from this moment forward they had to assume they were being watched, that every move they made would be reported and analyzed by people who wanted them dead. The evidence was too dangerous to keep in the cabin, Ezra said, too obvious a target if Holt and his men came looking, and they needed to hide it somewhere secure, somewhere that only the two of them knew about. He thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration, and then his face cleared, and he nodded as if confirming something to himself. He told Caleb about a root cellar on the back corner of his property, dug by the original homesteaders more than a century ago and long since forgotten, hidden beneath the collapsed remains of an old barn that had fallen in on itself decades before Ezra had even come to live here. The entrance was buried under rotting timbers and overgrown with brambles, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look, and the cellar itself was dry and secure, carved into the bedrock of the mountain. They would take the briefcase and the journal there tonight, Ezra said, would seal them up in waterproof containers and hide them where no one would ever find them, and then they would make their next move from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. Caleb nodded, feeling a small measure of relief at having a plan, at knowing that the precious evidence would be safe even if something happened to them, and he helped Ezra gather the supplies they would need for the short trek across his property to the hidden cellar. The darkness outside was nearly complete by the time they were ready, and they slipped out into the night like shadows, carrying the truth that Thomas Garrett had died for toward its temporary grave, knowing that soon they would have to bring it back into the light. Caleb made his way down the mountain the next morning, his legs aching from the previous day's exertions, but his mind clear and focused on the tasks ahead. The plans he and Ezra had made in the flickering lamplight of the cabin before he had finally collapsed into an exhausted sleep on a pile of blankets by the fire. They had agreed that Caleb would return home to check on his mother and gather some supplies while Ezra began reaching out to contacts he still had from his days as sheriff. People who might be able to help them get the evidence into the right hands without it being intercepted or suppressed by the Holbrook's network of corrupt officials. Caleb had been worried about leaving his mother alone for so long, had felt guilty for not telling her where he was going when he set out for Ezra's cabin. And he quickened his pace as the familiar landmarks of his property came into view. The old split-rail fence and the stand of white pines, and finally the cabin itself, its tin roof glinting in the late morning sun. But something was wrong. He could feel it before he even reached the porch, a heaviness in the air, a silence that was too complete. And when he pushed open the front door and stepped inside, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that she was trying desperately to suppress. Caleb rushed to her side, his heart clenching with fear, and he knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his and asked what had happened, what was wrong, his voice rising with panic. Mary looked up at him, and he saw that her face was pale and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. But beneath the tears there was something else, a fury that he had never seen in her before, a cold, hard anger that seemed to burn beneath the surface of her grief. She told him that Victor Holbrook had come to the cabin that morning, had driven up in his black SUV, and knocked on the door with a smile on his face as if he were a friendly neighbor stopping by to say hello. He had been polite, she said, almost charming, complimenting the property and asking about her work at the diner, and inquiring with what seemed like genuine concern about how she and Caleb were getting along since Daniel's death. But then he had started asking questions about Caleb, where he spent his time, what he did in the woods all day, whether he had found anything interesting during his explorations, and Mary had felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of his smile. She had answered carefully, giving nothing away, and then Holbrook had made his offer, a sum of money so large that it had taken her breath away. Enough to pay off all their debts and move somewhere far from these mountains and start a new life, free from the poverty and struggle that had defined their existence since Daniel's death. He said the company wanted to expand its operations, that this land was strategically important for their plans, and that he was prepared to be very generous to make the acquisition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. But Mary had heard the threat beneath the honeyed words, had seen the cold calculation in those gray eyes that reminded her of a snake watching its prey, and she had refused, had told him that the land was not for sale, and that she would thank him to leave her property and not come back. Holbrook's smile had not wavered, but something had shifted in his expression, a hardness that confirmed every fear she had, and he had said that he hoped she would reconsider, that it would be a shame if anything were to happen to such a nice family in such an isolated place. And then he had turned and walked back to his vehicle and driven away without another word. Mary gripped Caleb's hands so hard that it hurt, and she looked into his eyes with a ferocity that he had never seen before. And she said that she did not know what he had found in those woods, but she knew now that it was something the Holbrooks would kill to keep hidden, and she would not let them take her son the way they had taken her husband. Caleb looked at his mother's tear-stained face, at the fury and fear warring in her eyes, and he knew that the time for secrets was over, that he could not protect her by keeping her in the dark any longer. She was in danger now, real and immediate danger, and she deserved to know why, deserved to understand the full scope of what they were facing, so that she could make her own choices about how to respond. So he told her everything, starting from the beginning, from the moment he had stumbled upon the wrecked car in the ravine and seen the skeleton clutching the leather journal in its bony fingers. He told her about Thomas Garrett, the county surveyor who had discovered the Holbrooks' illegal dumping and gathered evidence to expose them, who had set out for the state capitol to deliver that evidence to the authorities and had never arrived. He told her about the journal and the briefcase, about the soil samples and water tests and photographs that proved the Holbrooks had been poisoning the valley's water supply for decades, sickening and killing people who had no idea that the water they drank was laced with arsenic and lead and mercury. He told her about Ezra Tate, the former sheriff who had tried to investigate Thomas's disappearance and had been threatened into silence, who had lived in exile for 30 years carrying the weight of his failure, but who had now agreed to help Caleb bring the truth to light. And then he told her the hardest thing, the suspicion that had been growing in his mind ever since she had revealed the truth about his father's demotion. The terrible possibility that Daniel's death had not been an accident at all, but a murder orchestrated by the Holbrooks to silence another man who had dared to speak out against them. Mary listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard that her knuckles turned white. And when Caleb finished speaking, she sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the wall as if she could see through it to some distant point beyond. Caleb watched her, his heart aching, afraid that he had broken something inside her that could never be repaired, that the weight of this knowledge would crush her the way it had threatened to crush him. But then Mary turned to face him, and he saw that her tears had stopped, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were blazing with a fire that transformed her from a weary, beaten-down woman into something fierce and formidable. She said that Daniel had been a brave man, the bravest she had ever known, a man who believed that right was right and wrong was wrong, and that a person had to stand up for their principles even when it cost them everything. She said she had loved him for that courage even as it terrified her, even as she begged him to stay quiet and keep his head down and not make trouble with people who could destroy them. And she said that she would be damned if she would let her son face this fight alone, would not stand by while another member of her family was threatened and hunted by the same monsters who had taken her husband from her. She reached across the table and gripped Caleb's hands in hers, her fingers strong and steady, and she looked into his eyes with an intensity that made him feel like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. She said they would fight, that they would take the evidence Caleb had found, and they would expose the Holbrooks for what they really were, and they would get justice for Thomas Garrett and Daniel and everyone else who had suffered at the hands of that family. She said she did not know how they would do it or what it would cost them, but she knew they could not live with themselves if they turned away from this, if they let fear make them complicit in the Holbrooks' crimes. Caleb felt tears burning in his own eyes as he listened to his mother's words, felt a swell of love and pride and gratitude that nearly overwhelmed him, and he squeezed her hands and nodded and said they would do it together, that they would honor his father's memory by finishing what he had started. That evening, Caleb led his mother up the mountain to Ezra's cabin, following the hidden trail through the darkening forest with a sureness born of repetition. And when they arrived, the old man was waiting for them on the porch, his shotgun leaning against the railing, and his pale eyes scanning the trees behind them for any sign of pursuit. Mary and Ezra regarded each other for a long moment, two people who had never met but who shared a common enemy and a common grief, and then Ezra nodded and stepped aside to let them enter. And Caleb saw something pass between the two adults, a recognition of shared purpose that needed no words. They sat around the rough wooden table in the dim lamplight, the fire crackling in the hearth, and they began to plan, pooling their knowledge and their resources and their determination to find a way forward. The problem was clear. They had the evidence, but they had no one to give it to, no authority they could trust to act on it without being corrupted or intimidated by the Holbrooks' influence. The local sheriff was in Victor's pocket. The county officials owed their positions to company money, and even the state police had proven susceptible to pressure when Ezra had tried to pursue Thomas Garrett's disappearance 30 years ago. They needed someone outside the system, someone with the resources and the courage to take on a powerful corporation, and the credibility to make people listen, and for a long moment none of them could think of who that might be. Then Ezra leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in concentration, and a light came into his eyes as a memory surfaced from the depths of his mind. He told them about a journalist named Diana Cole who had come to the county about 15 years ago, an investigative reporter from the state capital who had heard rumors about the Holbrooks and their business practices and had come to dig into the story. She had been tenacious, Ezra said, had asked all the right questions and pushed all the right buttons, and for a few weeks it had seemed like she might actually break through the wall of silence and corruption that protected the family. But then she had been stonewalled, her sources drying up overnight, her requests for documents denied, her interviews cancelled at the last minute, and eventually she had been forced to abandon the story and return to the capital empty-handed. Ezra remembered her frustration, remembered the fire in her eyes when she told him she knew there was something rotten in this county, and that someday she would prove it, and he had kept her card all these years, tucked away in a box of mementos from his time as sheriff. He rose from the table and rummaged through a cluttered shelf in the corner of the cabin, pushing aside old books and papers until he found what he was looking for. A small metal box that he brought back to the table and opened with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, among faded photographs and tarnished badges, was a business card, its edges worn soft with age but the printing still legible. Diana Cole, investigative correspondent, with a phone number and an email address from a news organization in the state capital. Ezra held up the card like a talisman, and he said that Diana Cole was their best chance, maybe their only chance, to get the evidence to someone who would know what to do with it. Someone with the platform and the resources to expose the Holbrooks to the world in a way that could not be suppressed or ignored. Mary took the card and studied it, her lips pressed together in a thin line of determination, and she said they would contact this journalist and they would tell her everything, and if she was half the reporter Ezra remembered, she would not let them down. Ezra made the call the next morning from his cabin, using an old satellite phone he had kept from his days as sheriff, a device that could not be traced or monitored by anyone in the county, and that still held a charge despite the years it had sat unused in its waterproof case. Caleb and Mary sat at the table watching as he dialed the number on the worn business card, their faces tense with anticipation, and they could hear the faint ringing on the other end of the line, each tone stretching out like an eternity as they waited to learn whether this lifeline would hold or snap. A woman's voice answered, brisk and professional, and Ezra introduced himself by name and said he had information about a story she had tried to pursue 15 years ago, a story about the Holbrook Mining Corporation that had been buried before she could bring it to light. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Caleb could almost feel the journalist's skepticism radiating through the phone, the weariness of someone who had been burned before and learned not to trust anonymous tips from strangers claiming to have explosive revelations. Diana Cole said she remembered the Holbrook story, remembered the frustration of hitting wall after wall, and she asked why she should believe that this call was any different from the dozens of other leads that had gone nowhere over the years. Ezra took a breath and played the one card he knew would get her attention, the name that had haunted him for 3 decades, and that he suspected had haunted her too. He said he had evidence related to the disappearance of Thomas Garrett, the county surveyor who had vanished in 1994, evidence that proved he had been murdered by the Holbrooks to cover up environmental crimes that were still ongoing to this day. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that for a moment Caleb thought the connection had been lost, and then Diana spoke again, her voice different now, lower and more intense, stripped of the professional detachment she had worn like armor. She said Thomas Garrett's name was one she had never forgotten, that his disappearance had been the thread she had tried to pull when she first came to investigate the Holbrooks, the mystery that had convinced her something deeply wrong was happening in that county even when she could not prove it. She asked what kind of evidence Ezra had, and he told her about the journal and the briefcase, about the soil samples and photographs and laboratory reports that documented contamination levels far beyond any legal limit, about the map of the cavern system showing how the poison flowed into the valley's water supply. He told her that Thomas Garrett's remains were still in his car at the bottom of a ravine where he had been left to rot for 30 years, and that a 12-year-old boy had found him and had the courage to bring the truth to light when grown men had failed. Diana was quiet for another long moment, and when she spoke again her voice was thick with emotion that she was struggling to control. She said she would meet them, that she wanted to see the evidence for herself, but that they needed to be careful because if the Holbrooks got wind of what they were doing, they would move to stop them by any means necessary. She suggested a location outside the county, a roadside diner 50 miles to the east where she had met sources before, a neutral ground where they would be less likely to be observed by Holbrook's network of informants. She said she could be there in 2 days, that she needed time to clear her schedule and make arrangements without arousing suspicion, and she told Ezra to bring everything he had, every document and sample and photograph, because if this was real, if this was what he said it was, then it was the story she had been waiting her entire career to tell. Ezra agreed to the meeting and wrote down the address of the diner. And when he ended the call, he looked at Caleb and Mary with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear, the face of a man who had just set something in motion that could not be stopped. They had decided to spend the night before the meeting at Ezra's cabin, all 3 of them together, both for safety and to finalize their plans for the rendezvous with Diana Cole, going over every detail of what they would say and what they would show her and how they would convince her that the evidence was genuine. Mary had been reluctant to leave their home unattended, had worried about what might happen to their few possessions if the Holbrooks decided to escalate their intimidation, but Ezra had insisted that they needed to stay together, that isolation was their enemy, and that the cabin in the hollow was too exposed, too easy for Holt and his men to approach without being seen. So they had locked the doors and shuttered the windows, and made the long hike up the mountain as the sun was setting. Mary struggling with the steep terrain but refusing to slow down or complain, her jaw set with the same determination that Caleb had seen when she declared they would fight. They spent the evening around Ezra's table, studying the evidence one more time, rehearsing the story they would tell Diana, and trying to anticipate every question she might ask and every objection she might raise. By the time they finally bedded down for the night, Caleb on his usual pile of blankets by the fire and Mary in Ezra's narrow cot, while the old man took a chair by the window with his shotgun across his knees. They were as prepared as they could be, and Caleb fell asleep with something almost like hope flickering in his chest. They set out early the next morning, planning to stop by the cabin to pick up some clothes and supplies before making the long drive to the diner. But as they came down the mountain and the cabin came into view, Caleb felt his stomach clench with a dread that he could not immediately explain. Something was wrong. The front door was standing open, hanging crookedly on its hinges as if it had been forced, and even from a distance he could see that the windows were shattered, shards of glass glinting in the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Mary let out a cry and began to run, and Caleb sprinted after her, his heart pounding with fear and rage, and they reached the porch together and stopped in the doorway, staring at the devastation inside. The cabin had been ransacked, torn apart with a thoroughness that spoke of desperation and fury. Every drawer had been pulled out and dumped on the floor, every cabinet emptied, every piece of furniture overturned and slashed open, as if the intruders had been searching for something hidden inside the upholstery. Mary's few precious keepsakes, photographs of Daniel and her parents, a china cup that had belonged to her grandmother, lay smashed and scattered among the debris, and her clothes had been pulled from the closet and thrown in heaps, some of them torn as if in spite. Caleb's loft had received the same treatment, his books and blankets and small treasures flung down to the main floor, and the loose floorboard in the root cellar had been pried up, the empty space beneath it gaping like a wound. Mary sank to her knees in the middle of the destruction, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and Caleb knelt beside her and put his arms around her, holding her tight as she sobbed. But even as he comforted his mother, he felt a grim satisfaction beneath his own shock and anger, because he knew what the intruders had been looking for, and he knew they had not found it. The evidence was safe, hidden in the root cellar beneath Ezra's collapsed barn, and the Holbrooks' desperation proved that they knew their secrets were about to be exposed. They were running out of time, and they were getting sloppy, and that meant they were afraid. They left before dawn on the day of the meeting, slipping away from Ezra's cabin in the old man's battered pickup truck, while the stars were still bright in the sky, and the forest was cloaked in a darkness so complete that Caleb could barely see his hand in front of his face. Ezra drove with his headlights off for the first mile, navigating by memory and instinct along the rutted track that led down from his property. And only when they reached the main road did he switch them on, the twin beams cutting through the gloom like yellow knives. They took a roundabout route to the diner, winding through back roads and small towns that added nearly an hour to their journey but made it almost impossible for anyone to follow them without being spotted. Ezra checked the rearview mirror constantly, his pale eyes scanning for any sign of the black trucks that Holt and his men favored. And Mary sat rigid in the middle of the bench seat with Caleb pressed against the passenger door, her hands clasped in her lap and her lips moving silently as if in prayer. The briefcase sat at Caleb's feet, the evidence that Thomas Garrett had died for, and he kept one hand on it at all times, reassuring himself that it was still there, that they had not come this far only to lose everything at the last moment. The sun was well above the horizon by the time they reached the diner, a squat brick building with a neon sign that flickered erratically, and a parking lot filled with trucks and sedans belonging to the farmers and salesmen who frequented the place. Ezra pulled into a spot at the far end of the lot where they could watch the entrance, and they waited, the engine idling, their eyes scanning every vehicle that pulled in. She arrived exactly on time, a woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, driving a nondescript sedan that she parked 2 spaces away from them. Diana Cole stepped out of her car and looked around the lot with the practiced wariness of someone who had spent her career meeting sources in places like this, and when her gaze found Ezra's truck, she gave a small nod and walked toward the diner entrance without looking back. They followed her inside and found her in a booth at the back, away from the windows, a cup of coffee already in front of her and a notepad open on the table. She did not waste time with pleasantries, simply gestured for them to sit and asked to see what they had brought. Caleb lifted the briefcase onto the table and opened it, and he watched Diana's face as she began to examine the contents, the vials of soil samples and the laboratory reports and the photographs of the dump sites and the hand-drawn map of the cavern system. Her expression shifted from skepticism to interest to something that looked almost like awe as she turned each page and studied each image, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with the fervor of a hunter who had just sighted her prey after years of fruitless searching. She said it was incredible, that she had never seen evidence so complete and so damning that this was enough to launch a full federal investigation into Holbrook mining and everyone connected to it. But she also said they needed to do something else, something that would make the story undeniable and force the authorities to act. They needed to report Thomas Garrett's body to someone outside the Holbrook's influence, to get his remains officially documented and recovered so that the murder could be proven beyond any doubt. She said she knew people at the state police and the FBI who could be trusted, who would not tip off the Holbrooks before they could act, and she would make the calls as soon as she got back to the Capitol. Diana Cole wasted no time once they parted ways at the diner, driving straight back to the state capitol with copies of the evidence locked in her trunk and her phone already pressed to her ear as she pulled out of the parking lot. She had spent 15 years building relationships with people in law enforcement who shared her commitment to justice, people who had grown as frustrated as she had with the way powerful interests could manipulate the system to protect themselves, and now she called in every favor she had ever earned. Within 2 hours, she had spoken to a captain in the state police whom she trusted implicitly, and a senior agent at the FBI field office who had been trying to build a case against corrupt mining operations for years, and both of them recognized immediately that what she was describing was exactly the kind of evidence they needed to take down not just a company but an entire network of corruption that had poisoned a region for decades. By late afternoon, a joint task force had been assembled, a team of state troopers and federal agents who were briefed on the situation and dispatched to the county with orders to secure the crash site, recover Thomas Garrett's remains, and begin the process of arresting everyone involved in the cover-up. Diana called Ezra on his satellite phone to tell them the good news, her voice crackling with excitement and relief, and she said they should go home and wait, that by tomorrow morning the Holbrooks would be finished and they would finally be safe. But Victor Holbrook had not built his empire by being slow or stupid, and he had eyes and ears in places that even Diana did not know about. Within an hour of her calls to the state police and the FBI, word reached him that something was happening, that outside law enforcement was mobilizing, and that his family's carefully constructed wall of protection was about to come crashing down. He sat in his office in the mansion on the ridge, staring out at the mountains that his grandfather had first come to exploit 70 years ago, and he felt the cold grip of desperation tightening around his chest. He could not stop what was coming, could not call in enough favors or spread enough money to make this go away, but he could still eliminate the source, could still punish the people who had brought this catastrophe down on his head. He summoned Holt and gave him his orders, his voice flat and dead, and Holt nodded and left without a word, gathering his men and loading them into 2 black trucks that roared out of the compound and headed for the mountain roads. Ezra was driving carefully as they made their way back toward his cabin, the afternoon light slanting golden through the trees, and Caleb was just beginning to let himself believe that the worst was over when he saw them in the side mirror, two black vehicles coming up fast behind them on the narrow, winding road. His blood turned to ice, and he shouted a warning, and Ezra looked in the rearview mirror and cursed and pressed the accelerator to the floor, but his old truck was no match for the powerful engines behind them. The first black truck pulled alongside and swerved into them, metal grinding against metal as Ezra fought to keep control on the narrow road, with the steep drop on one side and the rock face on the other. Mary screamed and Caleb grabbed the briefcase and held it tight against his chest, and he knew with terrible certainty that Holt had come to finish what the Holbrooks had started 30 years ago. The black trucks forced them to stop on a narrow stretch of road where the mountain dropped away on one side into a ravine so deep that the trees at the bottom looked like toys, and Ezra had no choice but to brake hard and pull to a halt, or risk being pushed over the edge into oblivion. The trucks boxed them in, one in front and one behind, and Holt stepped out of the lead vehicle with two of his men flanking him, their faces hard and their hands resting on the weapons holstered at their belts. Holt walked toward them with the unhurried confidence of a predator that had cornered its prey, his boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes fixed on the briefcase that Caleb clutched against his chest like a shield. Ezra reached for his revolver, but Holt's men already had their guns drawn, and the old man froze with his hand on the grip, knowing that any sudden move would get them all killed. Holt stopped a few feet from the truck and looked in through the window at Caleb and Mary huddled together on the bench seat, and a thin smile crossed his face that contained no warmth or humanity at all. He said they had caused a lot of trouble, that they had upset some very important people, and that it was time to hand over what they had taken and put an end to this nonsense once and for all. Ezra told him to go to hell, his voice steady despite the guns pointed at his head, and he said that the evidence was already in the hands of people who would use it to bury the Holbrooks forever, that killing them now would accomplish nothing except adding more murder charges to the pile. Holt's smile faded and his jaw tightened, and he said that was a risk his employer was willing to take, that dead witnesses told no tales and that accidents happened all the time on these treacherous mountain roads. He gestured to his men and they moved forward, reaching for the truck's door handles, and Caleb felt his mother's arms tighten around him as she pulled him close, her body shielding his as if she could protect him from bullets with her flesh. And then, just as Holt's hand closed on the door handle, a sound came drifting up from the valley below, faint at first but growing rapidly louder, a wailing chorus that echoed off the rock walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sirens. Holt's head snapped around and his men froze, and they all stared down the road as the first vehicle came into view around the bend, a state police cruiser with its lights flashing and its siren screaming, followed by another and then a convoy of black SUVs with government plates that could only be the FBI. Diana had tracked them, had given their route to the task force, and when they had not arrived home on schedule, she had sent the cavalry to find them. Holt stood motionless for a long moment, his face contorting through a rapid succession of emotions, rage and disbelief, and finally a cold calculation as he weighed his options and found them all wanting. His men looked to him for orders, their guns still drawn, but the cruisers were already screeching to a halt, and officers were pouring out with their weapons raised, shouting commands to drop their firearms and get on the ground. Holt let his hand fall from the truck door and stepped back slowly, his eyes meeting Caleb's through the window with a hatred so pure and intense that it felt like a physical blow, and then he turned and walked toward the approaching officers with his hands raised above his head, his men following suit. The confrontation ending not with a bang, but with the cold metallic click of handcuffs closing around their wrists. The next few hours unfolded with a swiftness that left Caleb feeling like he was watching someone else's life from a great distance, events cascading one after another with a momentum that could not be stopped. Holt and his men were handcuffed and placed in the back of separate cruisers, their weapons confiscated and their phones seized, and Caleb watched through the truck window as the man who had terrorized them was driven away without so much as a backward glance, his face blank and expressionless as if he had already begun calculating his legal strategy. A young FBI agent approached the truck and introduced herself, her manner calm and professional, and she asked if they were injured and if they had the evidence that Diana Cole had described. And when Caleb handed her the briefcase, she took it with a reverence that told him she understood exactly what it represented. Within the hour, a convoy was heading toward the Holbrook estate on the ridge. A dozen vehicles carrying state troopers and federal agents armed with warrants for Victor Holbrook's arrest on charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and a litany of other offenses that would keep teams of prosecutors busy for years. Caleb was not there to see it, but Diana Cole described it to him later, how Victor had come to the door of his mansion in a silk robe with a glass of whiskey in his hand, how his face had gone pale when he saw the badges and the guns, how he had tried to bluster and threaten and invoke the names of powerful friends before finally falling silent as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The empire that his family had built on poison and murder and corruption was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Meanwhile, Caleb rode in a state police vehicle back to the ravine where he had first discovered the wrecked car, guiding the officers along the faint trail and down the treacherous slope to the place where Thomas Garrett had lain undiscovered for 30 years. A forensic team followed, carrying equipment and body bags, and Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing and watched as they carefully documented the scene, photographing the car from every angle, collecting samples, and finally, gently, removing the skeletal remains of the man who had given his life trying to expose the truth. They treated Thomas with a dignity and respect that brought tears to Caleb's eyes, handling his bones as if they were precious artifacts. And when they lifted him from the driver's seat and placed him in a black bag for transport to the medical examiner's office, one of the officers removed his hat and bowed his head, and the others followed suit. A moment of silence for a fallen hero who was finally coming home. The evidence in the briefcase was turned over to the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit, and within hours, laboratory technicians were analyzing the soil samples and water tests, confirming what Thomas had documented 3 decades earlier, contamination levels so extreme that they constituted a public health emergency requiring immediate action. Diana Cole broke the story that evening, a special report that led every newscast in the state. Her voice steady and precise as she laid out the facts and showed the photographs and explained how a 12-year-old boy had stumbled upon a secret that powerful men had killed to protect. By the next morning, the story had gone national, reporters descending on Crestwood from across the country, and the name Holbrook had become synonymous with corporate greed and corruption and the arrogance of wealth that believed it could get away with anything. The investigation that followed was the largest in the state's history, a sprawling effort that consumed hundreds of hours of labor from dozens of agents and prosecutors and forensic specialists, all of them working to untangle the web of corruption that the Holbrook family had woven over the course of half a century. The evidence that Thomas Garrett had gathered 30 years earlier proved to be just the beginning, a thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire tapestry of crimes that stretched from the remote hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains to the corridors of power in the state capitol and beyond. Federal investigators seized computers and files from the Holbrook Mining Corporation's headquarters, and what they found was staggering. Decades of records documenting illegal dumping, falsified environmental reports, bribes to local and state officials, and payments to men like Holt for services that were described in careful euphemisms but that clearly referred to intimidation, assault, and murder. The forensic examination of Thomas Garrett's remains confirmed what Caleb had suspected from the moment he first read the journal, that Thomas had not died in an accident but had been murdered, his skull bearing the unmistakable marks of blunt force trauma that had been inflicted before the car went into the ravine. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, and investigators began the painstaking work of tracing the crime back to its source, following the evidence through old records and faded memories until they found what they were looking for: a payment made by Raymond Holbrook to a man named Virgil Crane, a known enforcer who had died in prison 10 years earlier while serving time for an unrelated assault. Crane had been Raymond's instrument, the man who had intercepted Thomas on that lonely mountain road and ended his life to protect the Holbrook empire. And though Crane himself was beyond the reach of justice, the man who had hired him was not. Raymond Holbrook was dead, but his son Victor had inherited not just his father's company but his methods, and the evidence showed that Victor had continued the conspiracy, had maintained the cover-up, had ordered Holt to silence Caleb and his family when they got too close to the truth. Victor was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and a host of environmental crimes, and he was denied bail and held in federal custody pending trial, his expensive lawyers struggling to find any defense against the mountain of evidence that the prosecution had assembled. But for Caleb, the most important revelation came not from the Holbrook files, but from a separate investigation that the FBI opened at his mother's request, a re-examination of the mining accident that had killed his father 3 years earlier. Investigators pulled the old safety reports and maintenance records and interviewed workers who had been afraid to speak at the time, And what they found confirmed the suspicion that had haunted Mary since the day she buried her husband. Daniel's death had not been an accident. The tunnel collapse that killed him had been caused by support beams that were known to be faulty, beams that should have been replaced months earlier but that had been left in place on orders from company management. Daniel had been assigned to that section of the mine deliberately, sent into a death trap by supervisors who were acting on instructions from Raymond Holbrook himself, punishment for the safety complaints that Daniel had filed and the questions he had refused to stop asking. The men who had carried out the order were identified and arrested, and new charges were added to Victor Holbrook's indictment, charges related to his knowledge of and participation in the cover-up of Daniel's murder, even if the original crime had been committed by his father. When Mary received the news, she wept for hours, tears of grief and rage and something that might have been relief, the agony of having her worst fears confirmed but also the solace of finally knowing the truth. Caleb held her and cried with her, and he thought about his father, about the brave man who had refused to stay silent even when it cost him everything, and he hoped that wherever Daniel was now, he knew that his son had finished what he started. Spring came to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a promise kept, the dogwoods bursting into clouds of white and pink blossoms, the streams running clear and cold with snowmelt, the air soft and warm and alive with bird song after the long silence of winter. Caleb stood with his mother at his father's grave in the small cemetery on the hill above Crestwood, the headstone freshly cleaned and decorated with wildflowers that Mary had picked that morning from the meadow behind their cabin. The Holbrook Mining Corporation was no more, its assets seized by the federal government, its executives facing trials that would drag on for years, its operations shut down permanently by court order. Teams of workers in hazmat suits had begun the long process of cleaning up the contaminated sites, removing the barrels of toxic waste from the caverns and purifying the water supply that had been poisoned for decades, and doctors were screening residents throughout the valley for the illnesses that the contamination had caused, finally able to treat what they could now properly diagnose. Victor Holbrook sat in a federal detention center awaiting trial on charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. And Holt and his men had already pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for their testimony against their former employer. Diana Cole had won a National Journalism Award for her reporting on the case, and she had dedicated the honor to Thomas Garrett, the man who had gathered the evidence and paid for it with his life. The state had given Thomas a proper burial with full honors, and his daughter, now a woman in her 40s who had spent 30 years not knowing what had happened to her father, had come to Crestwood to thank Caleb personally for giving her family closure. Ezra Tate had come down from his cabin in the high mountains and had become a regular presence in Caleb's life. A grandfather figure who taught him woodcraft and told him stories about the old days and reminded him that courage was not a single act but a daily choice. Mary put her arm around Caleb's shoulders as they stood before Daniel's grave, and she said that his father would be proud of him, that Daniel had always believed the truth was worth fighting for and that his son had proved him right. Caleb looked out at the mountains that had raised him, the ancient peaks and deep hollows that held so many secrets, and he understood now that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to seek the truth no matter the cost.